Todd Whittam here, owner and founder of Todd Whittam Tennis, also known as TW Tennis. We have a special guest today, and it's Ron Hohmann, father of Ronnie Hohmann, who you've seen in a bunch of my social media clips, as well as Parenting Aces. So Ron, tell us a little bit about the upbringing of Ronnie.
So Ronnie first started playing tennis when he was 3.5 years old. And when he started playing, he started with those foam balls. And after a few lessons, quickly graduated to regular tennis balls and was hitting from the service line. So Ronnie continued to develop his tennis up until 5 years old, when he actually played his first tournament. And that was the Little Mo tournament, where they have it segregated for each individual age group as 6, 7, and so on. And so Ronnie played in this tournament, was able to win his first match, and then lost to a very good player who was a year older than him in his second match. And as Ronnie continued to grow and progress, when he was 6 years old, started playing USTA tournaments, 10 and under tournaments. And Ronnie would play these tournaments and he would lose every match, 6-0, 6-0, 6-1, 6-0. And I personally didn't care that he was losing. I just wanted him to get the experience of playing in tournaments and also get the experience right away to losing, because I think that's a real big, important step with these kids, is to how to lose.
So Ron, Ronnie had some tough times coming up at a young age, around 6, 7, 8 years old in the sectional level, but then you put him into the national level. So explain that to us.
So as Ronnie progressed with his tennis from 6, 7, 8, 9 years old, he was starting to do better in the sectional tournaments, which allowed his ranking to increase in the sectional division and allowed him to be eligible for these national tournaments. So yes, I would take Ronnie to these national tournaments, and again, he would play a first round match, he would lose 6-0, 6-0. But I was trying to make Ronnie understand that you need to progress at each level. You can't just go into a national tournament expecting to win. So Ronnie would understand that he would have to improve himself within the sectional arena, okay? And then as he did that, his national results would then come.
So Ron, at around 8 years old, you started taking Ronnie to South Florida, maybe during some of his breaks from school and vacations and such. And you put him into all these different academies to try them out. So explain that process to us.
So what happened is we came down here one time on, whether it was Easter or Thanksgiving break, and I brought Ronnie to one academy down here in South Florida. And I watched how they coached, I watched how they trained, and while they were doing that, I would leave and go research some of the other academies and see how they trained, to compare them to each other. And there was about 4 or 5 academies that I researched. Ronnie played at about 4 of them, and then I finally settled in on one, because I thought the training aspect of one specific academy was much better than the other 4.
So I met Ronnie when he was 12 years old because his coach in New York was an unbelievable player, and his name is Robert Kendrick. So Robert gave me a call and said, hey, I have this kid who's really good, and he comes down periodically for his school breaks, maybe Easter, summer, and Christmas, and I want you to start working with him. So when I started working with Ronnie, I started to realize right away that this is a very talented little player. And at 12 years old, I knew that at some point he was going to really take off and become a great player. So what are your thoughts basically about Ronnie when he was 12 years old and through to his development from, basically to when he's 18 years old? What are you thinking at that time?
Well, it's a lot to think about. I think at that time, as a parent, unfortunately looking for instant results. Okay, looking back at it now, and many people or many parents will say this, or many coaches will say this, that it's a marathon, not a sprint. Okay, and hindsight's 20/20. When you look back at things, you can say, hey, I would have done things maybe a little bit different. But I think Ronnie had a pretty good path moving forward. The biggest thing for me with Ronnie was to make sure that he was being prepared, he was being trained, whether it was mentally or physically, to be the best player that he could be. Okay, and that was the most important thing about choosing a coach or having hit with certain players and making sure we had the right atmosphere around him.
So my next question is you and your wife approached me after watching me work with Ronnie, starting at 12 years old, but it was periodically throughout the next year or two. And at some stage, you said to me that at some point you would maybe like Ronnie to be full-time in Florida. So that's a tremendous sacrifice, not only from Ronnie, but also from you and your wife. So explain to me at that moment what you're thinking about sending your kid away by himself at 14 years old to live with me.
Yeah. So that's a really great question, because when Ronnie was in 8th grade, we decided to online school him, okay, which would allow Ronnie to increase his tennis training while taking care of his schoolwork at his own pace, which was great that we did that. And at that point, Ronnie was still in New York for the first half of that year, okay, his 8th grade year. And right around Christmas time, Ronnie actually said to us, hey, you know, I would like to maybe go to Florida and train with Todd for a few weeks or a month. So, you know, we then approached you with a Todd and said, you know, Ronnie would like to come down maybe the month of February and stay with you and see how it works out. And, you know, it was very unusual to us for Ronnie to come to us and ask, you know, why he wanted to go stay with Todd. But, you know, Ronnie had a goal, and his goal was to be a professional tennis player. So we wanted to allow Ronnie the opportunity to at least try it for a month, see how he felt or how we felt about it. And, you know, right now I think it was one of the best things we've ever done.
So at this time, your son was living with me full-time at 14 years old. So it was an interesting time not only for your son, but also for me, because he was by far the youngest player in my system. So I started training Ronnie on and off at 12 years old, and he was full-time at 14. So with my business in South Florida, I started training players a little bit later on. They were usually about 15 to 18 years old, and the parents wanted me to really fix them up to get them and send them off to a great college. But Ronnie, coming in full-time at 14, I really felt like I had an incredible amount of time to try to develop a very talented player. So when he was 14, I want you to know that he was basically flying home to see his parents. You didn't just send him off and say, bye-bye, Ronnie. He was basically going back and forth from New York, you know, on the weekend, basically every 4 to 6 weeks. Mm-hmm. So at that time, what were you thinking as a parent at that moment?
Well, I think the biggest thing for a parent, especially us, is number one, we had to find the right coach and the right fit. That was the biggest thing for Ronnie. And when you and Ronnie started hitting it off, Todd, we could see that it was a good fit. And, you know, the way you train and the way Ronnie, you know, started training with you, we definitely saw some tremendous progress in his tennis game. And sending him off was tough. You know, we're not seeing our child for many weeks at a time. But we made it a point to have Ronnie come back home every 4 to 6 weeks, like you said. And it was also very important for Ronnie to know that we would also come down to South Florida and watch him train, okay? And it was also very important for me and my wife to say, you know what, enough's enough to being involved with his tennis. It's time to let go and have the professionals do what they do best, and that is train Ronnie.
So Ron, at about 14 or 15 years old, you made it known to me that you wanted to have a hands-off approach with Ronnie's tennis, and so obviously you sent him off to me in Florida at 14 years old, but you wanted to, you know, really take a back seat to his tennis. So that must have been a little bit tough for you growing up as a tennis player and being so involved at his tennis at a young age. So explain that to me.
It's very tough. You know, I would hit with Ronnie probably every day on a court when he was younger, 3, 4, 5, 6 years old, all the way up to 9, 10, 11 years old, Todd. And it got to a point where there's probably very little that I can do to help his game progress, okay? And, you know, there's a time to be a parent and there's a time to be a coach. And I thought, for me, it was impossible to do both. So in Ronnie's best interest, it was time for us to let go, let Ronnie move on, okay, with 100% support behind us, and to let him train with you and to say, Todd, here's my son. I want you to train him. I want you to develop the path with Ronnie, with Pierre, and just keep me posted on what you're doing, how he's progressing. And we would chat at least once a week, once every couple of weeks, to talk about his progression. But again, we needed the hands-off approach, and I thought that was the appropriate thing to do with Ronnie at that time. That's exactly what he needed.
So Ron, at about 14 or 15 years old, Ronnie needed to keep traveling back to New York and to the Eastern section to play his tournaments. So I started developing a team around Ronnie because I couldn't really travel because of the other students in my system. So I brought in my longtime coach, Pierre Arnold, who's been one of the most well-respected coaches for almost 4 decades in South Florida. So he was now the traveling coach. So explain the relationship with Pierre.
So Pierre and Ronnie had a very good relationship. Pierre was very good for Ronnie when they traveled. Would get him up out of bed, would tell him what to eat, would tell him how to train, how to warm up, how to approach the matches, really coach him through the entire tournament. And that was a huge stepping stone for Ronnie to travel with somebody like Pierre, because with that tennis knowledge, from what you can receive from Pierre, is like no other in the tennis world that I've ever seen.
So bringing on my longtime coach, Pierre Arnold, to help me with the traveling with Ronnie was very interesting, because what I can tell you is that when Ronnie was about 12 or 13 years old, he was playing a national tournament locally here, and so I sent Pierre with Ronnie just to see how it would work out, and Ronnie hated it. He didn't like it at all, because he had this older fellow that was giving him all this structure and the game plan and how to warm up and stretch after his match and all these things that maybe he wasn't accustomed to. So that's your fault. But anyways, so when Ronnie came to live with me and everything, I hired Pierre to be the full-time traveling coach for Ronnie. So they were traveling to some of the nationals, but also some of the sectionals in the Eastern section. And I remember thinking, about Ronnie, basically that he's making like the quarters and the semis, and I would really love for him to start winning these events so he didn't have to go back to New York to, quite honestly, to play indoor tennis, which I thought was really not good for his development. So after a while, Ronnie started winning those sectional events, which means he was progressing, and Pierre was doing an amazing job. And so he then started playing national events, and this was maybe around 15 years old. So what were you thinking at that time when he was winning those events in New York?
Well, I thought he was progressing very well. That's one of the reasons why we wanted to have a good coach and a good support team behind Ronnie so he can progress in these national tournaments. The whole goal here with Ronnie, and his goal was, and still is, to be a professional tennis player. And he's going to continue to strive for that. But it is very important for Ronnie to develop that structure that he didn't have. And that's one of the reasons why, as a parent, we need to be a little more hands-off.
So when Ronnie turned about 16 years old, I used to have these discussions with Ronnie saying, listen, if you ever have a change of heart where you don't want to be a professional player, you've made tremendous sacrifices and you're already at a very good level where you could go to almost any school in the country and be an unbelievable contributor to one of these college programs. So if you ever have a change of heart where you don't want to be a pro player, you can go home to New York and be with your family and everything. And soon after we had these discussions, he basically came out of nowhere and won one of the biggest junior tournaments in the world called the Eddie Herr, which is played at IMG Academy in Bradenton, Florida. So going into the event, I thought that if Ronnie could have made the quarterfinals, I would have thought that this was a tremendous event. But I started having other coaches call me saying, this kid's going to win this tournament. And I kept saying to them, listen, he's never won a title of this magnitude. Let's see. It could be a first time, but I'd be very happy if he basically made the quarterfinals or around that type of event. So explain to me what you're thinking at that time.
Well, what I'm thinking at that time is, first of all, we're not even there watching. So that's the biggest thing, and that's the most important thing, I think, for Ronnie, is that he didn't have a parent and a coach at every single tournament, okay? And, for us as parents to step away and not go to these tournaments and not see him win them live, it was very, very tough to do. Yeah. But we knew for Ronnie that was the best scenario for him. It gave him the best chance to win, the best chance to focus and concentrate and do the best he can at these tournaments. And that was always our focus. Let Ronnie be the best tennis player that he could be, okay, without having a ton of parental influence behind him, okay? It really needed to be the coaching and the team that you put together, Todd.
So after Ronnie won his first really big international tournament, the Eddie Herr, a whole floodgate of different things started to happen. So he started getting phone calls, or actually I started getting phone calls from some of the world's best tennis coaches for him to train with the best tennis players in the world. It was Gael Monfils, Radu Albat, Fernando Verdasco, Kevin Anderson, Riley Opelka, Milos Raonic. I mean, we can go on and on and on about what actually happened to Ronnie. And if you go back and look at my social media, you'll see where I took clips of Ronnie training with the absolute world's best. So for me, it was super exciting. It was just an incredible time for me, and obviously it just probably, you know, dreams coming true for Ronnie. But at this time, when he was about 16 years old, a lot of his peers started to play ITF junior events all over the world. And so I remember having this phone call with you when I was driving back to my house, and you said, hey, Todd, you know, this one, that one, they're playing these ITF tournaments all over the world. And I said, Ron, we're not going that route, and I'm going to tell you why. Because first of all, I wanted Ronnie to not travel as much. I wanted him to keep developing his game. Right. And also, I wanted him to start playing professional events at 16 years old. And I gave you the reasons why. And it was because Ronnie's going to have a decision to make whether he turns pro at 18 or he's going to go the college route. So let's get as much experience as we can at 16 years old, 17 years old, and 18 years old, so that we can make the best educated decision based on how well he's doing, whether he's going to go the college route or he's going to turn pro. So while we're having that discussion and after that discussion, now what are you thinking about at that moment?
That was a very interesting decision you made, because you see 99% of all these kids start playing ITFs, traveling to these places all over the world, spending God knows how much money doing this. For what? Honestly, it's the point chase. To me, that's all it was. You know, let's point chase, let's get the ranking up as high as can be. Yes, it'll get you into the Australian Open Juniors or Wimbledon or US Open, whatever it may be, on those junior tournaments. But for us and you and me, it was never that focus. Right. Our focus was always geared towards making Ronnie the best tennis player that he could possibly be, have a path to professional tennis, and or a path to Division I college tennis. And for me, you could never replace those times that Ronnie got the hit with every one of those pros. Ronnie will never forget that. It's an experience that probably 95% of those kids have never had before we went to play in the ITF. So it was a great experience. I wouldn't change it, again, looking back. And unbelievable experience for Ronnie to play with those pros.
So Ronnie's had about 30 to 40 practices with the world's best players, from Gael Monfils to Kevin Anderson to Fernando Verdasco to Rajiv Ram to Gael Monfils to Radu Alba. I mean, we can go on and on and on. And the reason that he's been able to have these opportunities is that he has a pro-style game. We worked so hard on his game every single day for about 4 or 5 hours that he hits a big ball and he can keep up with these players, or else he wouldn't be invited back. So it's been incredible for him, and it's been great for me to see it. I've been in almost every one of those practices, so it's been very exciting for him as well as for myself. So let's fast forward now a little bit. And so because Ronnie didn't play ITF tennis tournaments, he then signed up for the Easter Bowl, which is one of the biggest junior tournaments in the world, played in Palm Springs, California, and he had to go through qualifying. So I'm thinking again, just like the Eddie Herr, if he can make the quarterfinals, I'm going to be really happy with that. And then Ronnie goes through qualifying. He then wins a match or two in the main draw. And Ronnie actually calls me, which I don't think I've ever had a student do this. And he says, I'm going to win this tournament. And I'm like, excuse me? Right? You know, yeah, just go win, man. You know, I'll talk to you later. But anyways, so he starts going through the draw, and I'm watching it on the live feed on my couch. And he's beating players that he's never beaten before in his life. Kids that he grew up with, playing against. Even a player that beat him maybe 6 months prior to in a futures event where I thought he should have won, but the player beat him. And so now all of a sudden, he's not just beating these kids, he's beating them pretty handily. And so Ronnie ends up winning this title, coming out of nowhere, and he was the first player in over 50 years to win the Easter Bowl tournament. And Pierre was there with him the whole time. And so it was very exciting for us as well, because we had Ronnie come basically out of nowhere again and he won a huge title. So now what are you thinking at that time?
Well, I was actually pleasantly surprised because we were able to watch the match on the internet this time, and like Eddie heard, we weren't able to watch it.
Yeah, but I thought you were out of the picture.
Out of the picture, but we're still watching the tennis match, so it was nice.
Okay.
But it was very interesting to watch him play, and a lot of these kids he played, they were playing nothing but ITF tournaments, and Ronnie hadn't played some of these kids in a couple of years, and some, like you said, may have beaten him 6 months ago or prior to that tournament. And it was very interesting to see how Ronnie handled himself. Again, he was with Pierre at the tournament, and the difference between this tournament, though, they allowed coaching, during the match, and I noticed that when I was watching the match, and not realizing right off the bat it was ITF rules, okay, which allowed the coaching, which I think helped Ronnie in a little bit.
Yep.
And watching him progress through these tournaments, playing some very good players. I mean, I think a couple of these players have actually hit with Federer and maybe Djokovic and practiced with them. So these are top-notch kids, and it was actually very nice to see Ronnie hold his composure through the tournament, play at a high level through the tournament, control his emotions for the most part, and as a parent, to watch him win and watch that last match and watch him hit that winning forehand for the Easter Bowl, you couldn't ask for anything better than that.
I agree. So at this moment, Ronnie was the first player in Easter Bowl history to win the title coming through qualifying. So maybe I should make it clear to the process that we took and what it took for Ronnie to start winning these big titles. First and foremost, I pushed him and trained him harder probably than any student I've trained. And it started at a younger age. I mean, from the physical training to the mental training to what we were eating at dinner to then stretching out at night before he went to bed. Everything, I wanted to make sure that it was in really good order for him to try to produce the best results that he could. And so I put some social media clips out there about how hard I was training Ronnie, but I never did really like a full day of 5 hours of really what I was putting this kid through. And so, for any player that moves into South Florida to join me in my system, to me, I feel a sense of responsibility to do the training right, because there's tremendous sacrifice. There's a lot on the financial aspect end of this as well. And I want to make sure that it was really beneficial for these families to really change their life and also their child's life, and really, to see how far these kids can take their tennis. So after Ronnie won the Easter Bowl at that moment, now what are you thinking?
It's a lot to think about because, we've had many conversations even before the Easter Bowl about Ronnie's training. And I don't think I once ever told you were training Ronnie too hard. I think probably many times I'd probably say you're not training him hard enough. And, there would be many times Ronnie would call us on the phone. He'd be dead tired. He'd be sweating or dripping from training or running 5-6 miles after training all day. And he'd be like, "Dad, I'm dead tired." And I said, "Okay, and so what's your point?" "That's good, Ronnie. You're training hard. We want you to train hard." Again, we've had conversations with my son. I've had conversations my wife has. "Ronnie, if you don't want to do it, you don't have to do this. You could always come home. You could always go to college, just like 95% of all the other kids in this country, and not play a sport and do whatever you want. But if you want to be a professional tennis player, you have to listen to Todd. You have to listen to Pierre. Okay? They have been through it. They have lived it. Pierre many times over. Todd played the tour. Okay? Ronnie, this is what you have to do." And he goes, "You're right, Dad." And he goes, "That's why I moved to South Florida."
So at this moment, it's either turn pro or go to college. So knowing Ronnie really well and training him for about 4 years, I started contacting some of the top colleges in the country, as well as them contacting me. And I felt like the best fit for him was to go and play for Andy Brandy at LSU, as well as for Chris Brandy, who I grew up competing against. And so I had a tremendous relationship with them, as well as Pierre having an incredible relationship with Andy. These are two of the most well-respected coaches for Pierre, a little under 4 decades, and Andy over 4 decades in the United States. So I thought it was a tremendous opportunity for Ronnie to go and play college tennis. And I thought, and still think, that we're still a couple years away for Ronnie to become a pro tennis player, both mentally and physically. But also keep in mind, Ronnie in professional events already defeated the #1 players from Baylor, Stanford, and the University of Florida. So he's already a pretty accomplished player before entering the college arena. But we still didn't think that he was ready to really play tennis full-time on the tour with these men that are so accomplished. So what are you thinking about that?
Well, number one was to set Ronnie up with the best possible coach in college. Okay? Andy Brandy has known Ronnie since he's 12 years old. Andy knows Ronnie's personality. Ronnie knows Andy very well. And it was a great fit to have Ronnie go play at LSU for Andy. Also, what was very important that we actually didn't have Ronnie start school until January of 2020, which was important to Ronnie because he wanted to train extremely hard all the way through the end of the year so he can be prepared for his college tennis. And I think maybe myself or my wife or maybe Ronnie even underestimated the transition he was going to have, going from training at TW Tennis with you and Pierre and going to train with Andy and Chris, that it wasn't going to be the same because now you have schoolwork. Now you're living on your own. You transitioned out of Todd's house and now you're going and living into a dorm with a couple of other kids. So that transition actually took a little bit of time for Ronnie to get used to. And then as he was getting used to it, ended up getting the flu for a couple of weeks. He got sick and the whole team ended up getting sick. Started getting back into it, and now this coronavirus started, so he really never got into the full swing of the college season. So now it gives him an opportunity to come back home, to train with you and Pierre again for 4.5 months. And I know now that you are going to train him as hard as ever. And I think he needs it going into his sophomore year of college.
So now having Ronnie at home is great, right? Unfortunately, his college season got cut short with the coronavirus. But I think it was a little bit of a blessing in disguise because for a young player, putting him into school in January, getting the flu, not the coronavirus, but he got the flu, expecting to be winning all the time. So that was a lot of stress for Ronnie, as well as juggling his college courses. So unfortunately, his season got cut short. And so we've been training incredibly hard. If you follow my social media, whether it's on Facebook or Instagram, you'll probably see what we're doing with Ronnie. It's really tough. So he's been able even to get a couple of unbelievable practices with Milos Raonic. So he's still training with professionals. And so he's having great training, but we have a training block of 4.5 months, which I already told Ronnie, you'll never have this ever again in your tennis career as an amateur or as a professional. So we have to hit it really hard, and we got to take advantage of these moments so that when you go back to LSU, you are really rocking and rolling and playing your best tennis. So tell me about what you're thinking now.
Well, my biggest thought process right now is for Ronnie to train his ass off. I'm just going to come right out and say it because that's what he needs to do. He needs to get in better shape, physically, mentally stronger from now until the end of August. And he will do that with you because Ronnie loves to train. He never complains about training. He works his ass off through the training because there have been times I've come and watched some lessons, some training, and yeah, it's tough, but Ronnie goes through it, and I've got to respect him for that. The biggest thing I think for Ronnie to be successful going into his full sophomore year now is to go in great shape, mentally, physically, and also having you work with Andy and Chris, setting up a program with him to work through at LSU to continue this training throughout the season. I think that's going to be the biggest success of Ronnie's career is if he can do that and manage his schoolwork.
I agree. So in closing, Ronnie still expresses to me that he wants to be a pro tennis player, which excites me to train him every day. Whether I'm going to train, a kid that wants to become a pro tennis player or a kid that wants to go to his dream college, I love training kids that want to put that maximum effort in every single day. That's what gets me excited to train these juniors that you see on my social media or I speak about on the podcast. So in closing, Ronnie's doing an unbelievable job. He's training his butt off basically every single day. When you look back on all the sacrifices that you, your wife, and your family made for this to happen for your son, what are maybe some of the mistakes or some of the things that you maybe, if you could turn back time, what would you do at this moment?
If I could turn back time, the one single thing I would have done is had him down here full time in South Florida earlier. Have him training with somebody like you or Pierre, and full time, not waiting till 8th grade. I'm not even sure, 13, 14 years old. If I was able to do it, I had a job, I had to pay for it. My wife, we had a daughter, so we also had, another child to look after who was also involved in many different activities. So it didn't all revolve around Ronnie's tennis, even though a lot of our time did. But I think in looking back, that would be the one thing I would change in anything that we've done with Ronnie. I probably would have had him down here, South Florida, full time at probably 8 years old.
I didn't pay him to say that. Just want to make this
No.
very clear.
No, he didn't pay me. And that's being brutally honest, Todd. And Ronnie had a lot of great coaches up in New York. Many of them very well respected. But in hindsight, that's one of the things I would have changed. But other than that, I probably would have had more time down here watching Ronnie play a little bit more. And really still kind of keeping that back seat, but doing it from a distance. But, Ronnie's had a great career so far. And we hope it's only just beginning. And the one thing I can also give any parent advice is, what they do in 12s and 14s at that time, it does matter, okay? But in the whole scheme of things, it really doesn't matter at all. Right. Our goal always was to have Ronnie to be a professional tennis player. And that's Ronnie's goal to this date. And for Ronnie to have the results he did at 16 and 18 years old, there's not many kids around that could say that they won the Easter Bowl and they won the Eddie Hurt tournament. So for Ronnie, I'm very happy where he's at right now. And as a parent, it was very difficult to stay away, but I had a lot of faith in you and Pierre to really take Ronnie to the next level. So I thank you, Todd.
Thank you, Ron.